The night I found out, I was doing something embarrassingly ordinary. I was reheating leftover pasta, standing at the stove in socks, watching the microwave count down. 37 seconds. That's how much time I had left before my entire understanding of my marriage collapsed. My name is Emery. I'm 41 years old. I'm an architectural drafter, not the glamorous kind, not the kind who designs museums or skyline towers. I draw load-bearing walls and stairwell clearances for mid-range residential developments. I am, by most measurable standards, a quiet man. The kind of man who fixes squeaky hinges before they become a problem. The kind of man who remembers to refill the water filter and notices when the succulents on the windowsill start to lean toward the light and rotates them every few days. My colleagues call me methodical. My wife, my soon-to-be ex-wife, called me boring. She wasn't always that cruel about it. Laurel and I had been married for 7 years when things started to unravel, though I understand now that the unraveling had begun far earlier than I ever allowed myself to see. We met through mutual friends at a rooftop party in late September. One of those evenings that smells like the city changing seasons, cold coming in from the north, the last warmth still rising from the concrete below. She was wearing a dark green coat and laughing at something I couldn't hear. I remember thinking she looked like a woman who knew exactly where she was going. That impression never entirely left me, not even at the end. We had no children. That was a choice Laurel made, and one I eventually accepted, more completely than I admitted to myself at the time. We had a house, a narrow 2-story in a leafy residential street, purchased 3 years into the marriage when the market still made sense to us. I paid the mortgage. She contributed to utilities and groceries, something she'd negotiated with a precision that, looking back, had less to do with fairness and more to do with leverage. For 7 years, I told myself we were happy. Or I told myself happiness wasn't the right word, that stability was better, that comfort was more honest, that not every marriage needed to crackle with electricity to be worth keeping. I had built a life around that belief. I had built myself around it. The microwave beeped. I took out the pasta. I sat at the kitchen table. My phone was face up next to my fork, and the Netflix notification was glowing softly on the screen, the kind that comes when someone starts watching on a shared account from a different location. I almost ignored it. I almost picked up my fork and let the moment pass. Instead, I tapped the screen. Laurel is watching, and then a location automatically attached because she'd never bothered to turn off the feature. Not our street, not her office building, not Amanda's apartment in the east end of the city. A hotel, 15 minutes away, one I recognized by name. I sat very still for a long time. The pasta cooled. The kitchen ticked. Outside, someone walked their dog past the window, the clatter of nails on pavement fading into the dark, and I thought. I remember this with strange clarity. I thought. So that's what it feels like. Not rage. Not even disbelief. Just the quiet, devastating sensation of a floor that had been rotting for a long time finally giving way beneath your weight. Let me go back. Because the night at the microwave wasn't the beginning. It was the end of a beginning I'd been living through for nearly 6 months without naming it. The first change I noticed in Laurel was not dramatic. It wasn't lipstick on a collar or the smell of someone else's cologne. It was the way she started holding her phone. She'd always been attached to it, the way most people are now, in the permanent low-grade way of checking and scrolling and tapping that we all pretend is an addiction. But somewhere around February, the relationship changed. She started carrying its screen down on every surface. She started sleeping with it plugged in on her side of the bed instead of on the shared nightstand. When I walked into a room, there was a half-second pause before she set it down. A micro-hesitation that I noticed the way you notice a draft from a window you were certain you'd closed. I didn't say anything. I noted it and filed it away under probably nothing, which is where I filed most things in those months. Laurel worked in brand strategy for a mid-sized consultancy. It was work she was genuinely good at. She had a precise, architectural sense of narrative, an ability to identify the emotional lever in any message and press it cleanly. When we first got together, I'd found that quality fascinating. She could walk into any social situation and within 20 minutes understand exactly what each person needed to hear and exactly how to make them feel seen without giving anything real of herself away. I'd interpreted this, early on, as emotional intelligence. Later, I would understand it as something different entirely. In February and March, she started working late. Not dramatically, not so late that it demanded explanation. Just 40 minutes here, an hour there. She'd come home still in her work clothes, slightly flushed, and go straight upstairs to shower before dinner. I cooked most evenings. I'd save her a plate, leave it covered on the counter. She'd eat standing at the kitchen island, scrolling her phone, offering half answers to whatever I said. I thought she was stressed. Her firm had taken on a difficult rebrand for a national retail chain. I knew this because she'd mentioned it twice in the previous year, which was roughly twice the amount she typically talked about work with me. So I gave her space. I brought her tea she didn't ask for. I made sure the house was quiet when she got home. I was, in other words, exactly the husband she'd always complained she didn't have enough of. But the distance didn't warm. In April, the intimacy stopped entirely. Not gradually. It simply ended, cleanly, the way a channel cuts to static. One night she turned away from me in bed, and then every night after that she turned away from me in bed. And I told myself that bodies go through rhythms, that long marriages have seasons, that this was a winter and spring would come. I remember a specific Sunday afternoon that month. We were both home, the light coming through the kitchen windows at that low April angle that makes everything look slightly overexposed. I asked if she wanted to go for a walk. We used to walk on Sunday afternoons, along the canal path, sometimes stopping at a coffee cart near the old mill. She was sitting at the table with a glass of wine, phone flat on her palm, reading something, and she looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as mild impatience, as if I'd interrupted something important. "I'm tired," she said. No, not maybe later. Just tired," offered like a closed door. "Okay," I said, and I put my jacket back on the hook and went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor for a while. That should have been enough. That should have been the moment I asked a harder question. But I was patient. I was, as Laurel had told me many times in many different ways, excessively patient. It was one of the few things she said about me that was genuinely true. Her friend Amanda became a regular feature in her schedule around this time. They'd known each other since university. Amanda was the scattered, warm, slightly chaotic counterweight to Laurel's composure. I liked Amanda. She laughed too loudly at her own jokes and always brought wine when she visited, and once helped me repaint the back fence on a whim when she came over and found me halfway through the job. She felt like a genuine person, which was not something I could say about all of Laurel's acquaintances. Laurel started mentioning dinners with Amanda. Casual mentions slipped into weekly conversation. "Amanda and I are getting dinner Thursday. Don't wait up." And I accepted them without much thought, because Amanda was real to me, because the alibi had texture and history. That's how good lies work. They're built on a foundation of something true. What I didn't know, and wouldn't know for months, was that Amanda had moved to Edinburgh in January. A job offer, a new life, a clean break from the city. Laurel had attended her going-away drinks in December, waved her off at the airport, and then continued to use Amanda's name as a standing reservation she could book against any evening she needed to disappear. By the time I realized this, I had 6 months of phantom dinners already behind me. The first concrete thing I noticed, the first thing I couldn't immediately rationalize away, was the car mileage. I should explain. Laurel drove my car occasionally when hers was in for service, and in late May her car spent 4 days at the garage having a recurring brake issue properly addressed. She used mine for those 4 days. On the evening, she returned it, and I got back behind the wheel. I glanced at the odometer out of habit. I track mileage for expense purposes, a professional habit from years of site visits. The difference was 23 miles more than the route from home to her office and back, multiplied by 4 days, could reasonably account for. 23 miles. It's such a small discrepancy. I sat in the parked car and did the arithmetic in my head twice, and both times it came to the same thing. She'd been somewhere she hadn't mentioned. I didn't confront her. I told myself it could be a detour, a shop she'd stopped at, a route she'd taken to avoid traffic. I told myself I wasn't the kind of man who interrogated his wife over 23 miles. And both of those things were true. What was also true was that I went upstairs that evening and very carefully did not say anything. And Laurel was on her phone in the bedroom. And when I walked in, she tilted the screen away with that half-second delay that I now knew to look for. I began to pay attention differently after that. Not obsessively, not yet, but with a quietness, a watchfulness I hadn't used since the early years of my career when I was new enough to site visits that I had to listen for everything, because I didn't yet know what sounds to ignore. Her moods shifted in a pattern I slowly mapped. There were evenings she came home bright. Not happy bright, not warm, but bright in the tight, lit-up way of someone who has recently gotten something they wanted. Those evenings, she was almost charming. She'd ask me a question about my day, actually wait for the answer, pour herself a glass of wine and lean against the counter with her arms loosely crossed, and I'd feel the faint stirring of something that felt like the marriage I thought we had. I'd find myself talking more than usual, filling the warmth she was briefly emitting. Then there were the other evenings. Flat, compressed, the kind of silence she generated that had weight to it, that sat on the room like a low ceiling. Those were the evenings when she'd eaten something before she came home. I could tell by how she moved around the kitchen, the lack of appetite, the deliberate way she assembled herself. Those were the evenings I understood. Later, she'd seen him, and something hadn't gone the way she wanted. His name was Theo. I didn't know that yet. What I did find, in early June, was a receipt. Not hidden, just forgotten, slipped behind the sun visor on the driver's side of her car, which she'd been using again for a week while mine was detailed. I found it while looking for my parking disc. A restaurant receipt, dinner for two, a Friday night in April. A Friday she'd told me she was working late on the retail rebrand. The restaurant was 40 minutes from our house, in a neighborhood neither of us had any reason to be in. The total was appropriate for two people who'd eaten well and split a bottle of wine. The timestamp was 9:47 p.m. I photographed it on my phone, put it back, and went inside. That night, I lay in the dark beside my sleeping wife and tried to reconstruct April. The late nights. The dinners with Amanda who was in Edinburgh. The showers before dinner. The phone held screen down. The mileage. The mood patterns. The Sunday when she'd said tired and closed the door. I realized with a slow, cold clarity, very carefully managed. She wasn't distant because she was stressed. She was distant because her attention was somewhere else. The warmth on certain evenings wasn't affection for me. It was overflow from somewhere she'd just come from. The flatness on other evenings wasn't exhaustion. It was something I didn't yet have the right vocabulary for. I thought about waking her. I thought about laying the receipt on the pillow between us and saying nothing, just watching her face when she opened her eyes. But I didn't. Because I knew. I think I'd known for a while, in the particular way that knowing can live in your body before it reaches your mind. That if I moved too soon, she would know I knew, and she would shift, and the small pieces I gathered would scatter, and I would be left with nothing but her explanation and my doubt. So I waited. I was patient. I was, as she'd told me, excessively patient. And then I went downstairs, heated up the pasta, and the Netflix notification appeared. The hotel was called the Meridian. I knew it. Had driven past it dozens of times on the way to a development site I worked on the previous year. Mid-range, clean, discreet, the kind of hotel that exists specifically to be unremarkable. The Netflix location data showed Laurel's profile active from a room on the hotel's network at 8:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. She'd told me she was having dinner with Amanda. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table after the pasta went cold and thought very carefully about what I knew and what I could verify and what I was actually prepared to do. By morning, I had a list. The receipt. The Amanda alibi that couldn't hold. I pulled up Amanda's Instagram on my phone, and there she was, documented in Edinburgh. A flat warming photo from February, a picture outside a gallery tagged in the Scottish capital, a post from just last month showing Holyrood Park in the rain. Not in the city. Not available for dinner. The hotel location data. The mileage. The mood patterns I'd mapped. The receipt for two. It was enough to be certain. It wasn't enough to be clean. And I discovered something in myself that surprised me. I didn't want to be merely certain. I wanted the full shape of it. Not for any vengeful reason. Not to use against her. Not to perform the role of wronged husband in some confrontation scene. I think I needed it the way you need to see the whole extent of a wound before you can decide how to treat it. I went to work. I drafted stairwell clearances. I ate lunch at my desk. I came home, and Laurel was already there, cutting vegetables at the island with the focused efficiency she brought to all small domestic tasks, and she asked me how my day was in the pleasant, absent tone that I now recognized as performance. Fine, I said. Yours? Busy, she said. Lunch meeting ran long. I nodded. I set down my bag. I watched her hands on the knife. That weekend, I went to see Marcus. Marcus had been my closest friend since university, a broad-shouldered, unhurried man who worked in facilities management for a large hospital trust and had the particular competence of someone who had spent 2 decades solving problems other people didn't know how to name. He was also the only person I trusted completely. I told him everything. Not in the dramatic way, not with the receipt on the table and the phone data projected on the wall. Just quietly, in the order it had happened, in his kitchen, while his kids watched something in the room next door and his wife, Kay, stayed tactfully upstairs. I laid it out the way I'd lay out a structural issue in a building. This element is failing. These are the signs. This is what I think is happening underneath. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat back and looked at the table for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to know who," I said. "And I want to know how long. And then I want to make decisions that I can stand behind in a year." He nodded. "Okay," he said. "Let's think." The way I found Theo was almost accidental, or rather, it felt accidental, though I think I'd been moving toward it without knowing. I'd been going through the small stack of papers I kept in the home office, mortgage documents, household insurance, things I periodically reviewed, and I found a letter I didn't remember receiving. From a solicitor, dated 3 months earlier, addressed to Laurel, mistakenly placed in the shared file rather than wherever she kept her personal correspondence. I almost put it aside. Then I read the first 2 lines. It was a preliminary inquiry about property ownership rights in the event of separation, specifically concerning homes where one partner had contributed to the mortgage over a significant period. Laurel's name was there. A case reference number. A solicitor's name I didn't recognize. She had been to see a lawyer. About the house. 3 months ago. I sat very still for a long time, the letter held flat on the desk in both hands, the way you hold something fragile. I thought about the Netflix location data, the receipt, the Amanda alibi, the mileage, the mood patterns, and now this. A legal consultation. A quiet, preliminary survey of the terrain. She wasn't having an affair. She was planning an exit. And she was planning to take the house with her. I called Marcus that evening. I told him about the letter. "She's been planning this," I said. The words felt strange in my mouth, not quite real yet. "Emery," he said quietly, "you need to talk to a lawyer." Today. I did. Her name was Diane, a family law solicitor Marcus had used on behalf of a colleague once. We spoke for 50 minutes on the phone that night. She asked careful, measured questions and gave me careful, measured answers about what I could document, what I could protect, and what I needed to do before anything became official. I followed her instructions exactly. The following Tuesday, I had a flex day, office closed for a facilities upgrade. I spent the morning at my home desk, and late morning I drove to the Meridian. Not with any plan, just to see it, just to make the geography real. I sat in my car across the street for 20 minutes. Then I went inside and asked for a coffee at the bar because I needed to be somewhere other than my car. I sat on a stool near the window and drank it, watching the street, and that's when I saw him. He came in from outside, checked his watch, spoke briefly to the front desk, and then turned and scanned the lobby with the slightly tense expression of someone waiting. He was younger than me, mid-30s, well-dressed, dark hair, the kind of handsome that isn't remarkable but reads as settled and confident. He took out his phone and typed something. 30 seconds later, Laurel walked through the door. I watched her cross the lobby. She didn't see me, her eyes were on him, and her face did something I hadn't seen in a long time. It relaxed. Not into happiness, exactly. Into a kind of controlled satisfaction, the expression of someone arriving at something they feel they've earned. He kissed her cheek. They went upstairs. I sat for another minute. Then I paid for my coffee and drove home and sat in the driveway for a long time. His name. I found it by the next morning through a combination of Laurel's phone left unattended on the charger and a password she'd been using since we met that she'd never bothered to change with me. Was Theo. Theo Renner. Investment analyst. 40 minutes across the city. And then, in a turn that I did not anticipate, a message in their thread from Theo, 3 weeks earlier, that I read once and then set the phone back down on the charger. "I need to be honest with you. This is becoming more than I can manage. You're exhausting, Laurel. I think we want very different things." She had not replied to it. The read receipt showed she'd seen it. Below it, sent the following day, was a single line from Laurel. "We'll talk on Tuesday." She was fighting to keep him, and she had already been to see a lawyer about the house. The conversation with Theo happened on a Thursday, which I will acknowledge was not my most composed decision. But I had thought it through, or I had thought I'd thought it through, and I drove across the city with Marcus in the passenger seat, who had insisted on coming and who was, as it turned out, the main reason the conversation didn't go sideways. We found Theo's building, a glassed residential tower in the financial quarter, and I called the number I'd found for his firm and asked for him directly and told the receptionist it was personal. He came down to the lobby. He recognized me immediately. I could see it in the microsecond his face did before it settled into careful blankness. He'd seen a photograph somewhere, most likely, or Laurel had described me in enough detail that my face was already filed somewhere in his mind. "Emery," he said. It wasn't a question. "Theo," I said, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to understand what's been happening." He glanced at Marcus, who was standing a few feet back with his hands in his coat pockets and his face giving nothing away. "You should talk to Laurel," Theo said. "I'll talk to Laurel," I said. "I'm talking to you first, because I've been reading your messages, and I think you might be operating with more clarity than she is right now. And because I think you're already trying to end this." Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, or not only guilt. Something more like relief at being read correctly. We stood in the lobby of his building for 20 minutes. He told me, carefully, in the measured way of a man choosing what to offer, that he'd met Laurel at a professional event in January. That it had started as what he described as intensely compelling. That over the past 2 months it had become something else, controlling, cyclical, exhausting. That she had told him about the house. That she had talked, more than once, about what her life would look like when she was free. "She always framed you as the obstacle," he said, and he seemed to understand how that sounded as he said it, because his jaw tightened slightly afterward. "I'm sorry. I didn't know you. I only knew her version of you." "What changed?" I asked. He looked at me steadily. "I started to notice how she talked about people. About everyone, not just you. The way she discussed her own mother. The way she talked about colleagues she needed things from." He paused. "I don't think she's capable of something genuine. I think she needed me to believe she was. And I did for a while." I thanked him. He looked slightly surprised by that. We shook hands, which I think surprised him more, and Marcus and I walked back to the car. "You all right?" Marcus said, when we'd been driving for a few minutes. "No," I said, "but I know what I'm doing now." That evening, I changed the locks. I called a locksmith at 4 in the afternoon, and by 6 o'clock the front and back doors had new cylinders. I packed a bag for Laurel, efficient, complete, everything she'd need for a week, and I left it in the front porch. I called Diane, my solicitor, and left a message documenting what I'd done and why. I sent Laurel a text at 6:15 p.m. "I know about Theo. I know about the solicitor. I know about Amanda. Come get your bag from the porch. We'll talk tomorrow," calmly. She called me 11 times in the next 40 minutes. I didn't answer. The 12th time I picked up. "Emery." Her voice was very controlled. That precision I'd always admired. "You need to let me in. Right now? This is my house." "It's our house," I said, "which is why I've already spoken to a solicitor. Come get your bag." A silence. Then, "You went through my things." "My phone. That's an invasion of privacy." "Laurel," I said, "get your bag from the porch. Don't you dare do this to me." "I'm not doing anything to you," I said. "You're doing something to me. And I'm just making sure I'm protected while it happens." Another silence. Longer this time. When she spoke again, the control had a hairline crack in it. "This isn't over," she said. "I know," I said. "That's why I have a solicitor." I hung up. I sat on the stairs in the hallway for a while, very still, looking at the new keyhole in the front door. What happened over the following 2 weeks was Laurel at her most precisely designed. She sent messages that cycled through every available register. Wounded, then conciliatory, then accusing, then clinical. She texted Marcus. She contacted a mutual acquaintance named Dana and told her a version of events in which I had snapped under pressure, changed the locks without warning, refused to communicate. Dana texted me a concerned message asking if I was all right, and when I replied with a brief factual account, she went quiet and I didn't hear from her again for a while. Laurel appeared at the house on a Saturday, unannounced, with her mother beside her. Her mother, Irene, was a small, sharp-faced woman who had always been cordial to me in the remote way of someone managing a necessary relationship. She stood on the doorstep behind Laurel with her hands clasped in front of her and said, very precisely, "Emery, I think you both need to sit down and have a grown-up conversation. I agree, I said. I've suggested that to Laurel several times this week. She preferred not to, except on her own terms. Laurel said something then, a practiced, emotionally loaded sentence about how she hadn't been happy for years, about how she'd been trying to make things work for so long, about how I'd never really seen her or met her emotionally. I looked at her. I thought about the solicitor letter, 3 months old, the Tuesday afternoons at the Meridian, the Amanda alibi, the message to Theo, when I'm free. I know about the property consultation, I said quietly. Irene's face did something involuntary, a tightening around the eyes, a small caught breath. I looked at her directly. You knew, I said, not as an accusation, just as a fact I was setting down between us. She held my gaze for 2 seconds, then looked away. You knew she was planning to leave, I said, and you didn't tell me, and that's your choice to carry. I looked back at Laurel. Come back on Wednesday with a list of what you'd like to take from the house. I'll make sure I'm not here. Anything that's yours is yours. But the conversation about the house goes through the solicitors. Laurel's composure fractured for a moment. Just a moment. Barely perceptible if you didn't know her face well enough to read its small seismic events. Then it reformed. You'll regret this, she said. Maybe, I said. Goodbye, Laurel. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a long time after I heard their footsteps retreat down the path. The house was very quiet. The light was coming through the frosted glass panel beside the door, the late afternoon angle I'd lived with for years, and I thought about the Sunday I'd put my jacket back on the hook and gone upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed. All those small moments of accommodation, of patient retreat, of space I'd given her that she'd never filled with anything true. I thought about Theo saying, I think she needed me to believe she was capable of something genuine. I had believed that for 7 years. The divorce took 8 months. It was not as brutal as it could have been, and not as clean. There were 2 rounds of solicitor letters about the house. Laurel contested, citing her contribution to shared household expenses as grounds for partial equity. Diane navigated it with exactly the steady, unhurried competence I needed. The outcome was fair. The house was mine, my mortgage, my name, and Laurel received a settlement that reflected her actual financial contribution over the years of the marriage. She signed the papers on a Tuesday. I heard, through a source I didn't ask about and didn't need to, the information simply arrived, the way information does, that Theo had officially ended things with Laurel sometime in July. That he'd done it cleanly, in person, and that it had not gone peacefully. That she'd called his workplace twice in the following week. That she'd contacted his sister. That she had, in the end, tried to manage her way out of his exit the same way she'd tried to manage her way through everything. I felt, when I heard that, something complicated. Not satisfaction exactly. Not pity either. Something closer to recognition. The particular feeling of understanding, finally, that the thing you experienced was not personal to you. That it was Laurel's pattern, and that you had been one iteration of it. That Theo was another. That there would be others still. I stayed in the house through the winter. I fixed the hinge on the bathroom cabinet that had been squeaky for 2 years and that I'd somehow never gotten around to properly addressing. I moved the succulents back to the south-facing windowsill, where they'd always done better. I cooked for myself in the evenings, slowly, without the background anxiety of gauging another person's mood. Marcus came over on a Friday in November, and we ordered food and watched 3 hours of television without talking much. And at some point, I realized I felt comfortable in my own home in a way I hadn't felt in a long time, maybe years. Comfortable in a bone-deep, quiet way that didn't require anything from anyone. You look better, Marcus said at some point. I feel better, I said. And it was true. Not healed. Not the uncomplicated, uncreased version of better that people describe in tidy endings. But genuinely, honestly better. Like a weight I'd carried so long I'd stopped noticing it was heavy had simply been set down. The thing I kept returning to, in the months after, was not the betrayal itself. Not the hotel, not the receipts, not the solicitor letter. Those things had happened, and they were real, and they had hurt with the specific, structural kind of hurt that comes from discovering the building you thought you were standing in was never load-bearing. But I had survived that. What I kept returning to was the year before I found out. The year of accommodation, of patient retreat, of giving space that was never going to be filled. I had not been passive because I was weak. I had been passive because I had convinced myself that patience was the same as love. That enduring discomfort was the same as being present. That staying was the same as choosing. It isn't. Irene called me once, in February. I picked up because I was surprised enough by the sight of her name on my screen that I answered before I thought about it. I wanted to say I was sorry, she said. Flat and direct, the way Laurel was never direct. I knew she'd been to the solicitor. She told me in the spring. I should have told you. I thought about asking her why she hadn't. I thought about all the answers she might give. Then I said, "Thank you for calling." A pause. "She wasn't always like this," Irene said quietly. And there was something in her voice, not quite grief, but the adjacent register to it. The sound of a person who had watched a thing happen across years and hadn't known how to stop it. "I know," I said. "I believed that for a long time." We said goodbye. I didn't expect to hear from her again, and I didn't. What I understand now, clearly, is that Laurel did not cheat on me because she wanted Theo. She cheated on me because she needed to be in control of her exit, and the affair was part of the architecture of that, a structure she was building towards something she had decided on without telling me. She needed to leave from a position of power with the house, with a narrative she controlled, with a replacement already in place. She needed to not be the one left. The control was always the point. The marriage had been, from some angle I could only see clearly once I was outside it, a long-running management project. Her emotional distance wasn't neglect, it was leverage. Her warmth, when she offered it, wasn't affection, it was maintenance. I had been kept at a precise temperature, close enough to remain invested, distant enough to never fully secure. Understanding this did not make it stop hurting, but it made it stop feeling personal in the way it had. It moved the wound from the place where I kept questions about my own worth and relocated it to the place where I kept facts about other people's behavior. I am 41 years old. I am an architectural drafter who rotates succulents and fixes squeaky hinges and, as it turns out, can change the locks when the situation genuinely requires it. I am patient, still genuinely patient. But I understand now what patience is for and what it can't substitute for, and the difference between giving someone space to grow and standing in a room where the walls have been quietly closing around you for years. I don't know if I'll trust someone completely again. I think I probably will. Not because I've forgotten what happened, but because I am, in the end, someone who believes that most buildings, if you understand how they're made, can be constructed to hold. The story of Emery and Laurel is, at its structural core, a case study in the collapse of a relationship that was never built on genuine emotional reciprocity, but one where only one party knew that from the beginning. From a psychological perspective, the most striking element of this story isn't the infidelity. It's the precision of Laurel's behavior. Her emotional management of Emery, the calibrated warmth after evenings with Theo, the enforced distance that kept him invested without giving him security, reflects what psychologists call instrumental use of intimacy, deploying closeness as a tool rather than experiencing it as a state. At what point do you think Emery truly stopped being a partner to Laurel and became a problem she was managing? The clues were there long before the Netflix notification. The phone held screen down. The micro-hesitation before setting it down. The Sunday with the jacket. These were not the behaviors of a woman who had drifted away. They were the behaviors of a woman already somewhere else. Emery's response to those early signals, filing them under probably nothing, giving more space, making more tea, was not naivety. It was the deeply human refusal to act on incomplete evidence that would require the dismantling of something you've built your life around. Denial of this kind doesn't come from stupidity. It comes from attachment. He wasn't ignoring the signs. He was protecting himself from what they meant. The distinction matters, because understanding it is the first step toward understanding how otherwise perceptive people end up in situations like this for so long. The Amanda alibi is one of the story's most psychologically instructive elements. It worked not because it was clever, but because it had a foundation of truth. Laurel chose Amanda because Amanda was real, because Emery trusted her, because the alibi had texture and history. This is how manipulation operates at its most effective. It uses genuine information as scaffolding for constructed falsehood. Would you have questioned a friend's name being used as a cover? Most people wouldn't. Most people don't check Instagram for proof of location before accepting a dinner plan. The solicitor letter represents the most significant single escalation in the story, the moment the narrative shifted from infidelity to something more architecturally deliberate. Laurel wasn't simply having an affair. She was conducting a controlled, multi-fronted maneuver, maintaining the marriage as a stable base, building a legal position around the house, keeping Theo in place as her transition point. When Emery found that letter, the emotional register of the story changed. It stopped being about betrayal and became about the nature of the relationship itself. Had it ever been what he believed it was?